Hi there, Robbie. Thank you very much for joining us on the Uncast Show. It's great to have you here. The first thing I'd like to ask you, really, for people who don't know you, you run a YouTube channel called NASCompares. Can you share how your interest first started into network-attached storage and how you decided to start up the website and the YouTube channel?
I mean, well, much like most cool people out there, it all stems from gaming. Originally, I would sort of repurpose... I mean, we're talking like late teens, early 20s. We would repurpose old Windows XP systems as working as Counter-Strike Source and Soldier of Fortune, Jedi Knight on a rough day, and turn it into like servers. And so from there, that was where a lot of my interest came from, the kind of networking and storage banded together. And then around about 2007, 2008, I started working for an e-retailer that dealt with storage predominantly. And from there, that was kind of where the nuts and bolts of it was organically sort of thrown at me. And a lot of it was coalface type stuff. And then there was a lot of build stuff until eventually it sort of gave way to just marketing it. Just because one of my keenest interests, I know it sounds a bit out there, but this is an incredibly technical subject for the most part, that those who don't know what they're talking about either find it too dull to care, or it's just not profitable for them to care. And half the motivation at the beginning, the other half being on camera, hello. The first half of the motivation was always to take an incredibly complex subject and make it crayon and chewable friendly. So that's kind of where it all started with the blog. It was taking even something like RAID and trying to talk about the different kinds of storage pools and volume allocation and iSCSI LUNs and all that stuff, and basically turning it into crayon Lego English. And that's kind of how it started. And then we suddenly realised how much of that could actually be translated into easy. And that's what effectively every video has become. Every time we tackle a subject, we try to keep it as chewable, as easy and understandable as possible, because there are lots and lots of platforms out there, bigger and I would argue smarter than me, that tackle this subject with a sense of technical nuance I do not have. But if you're starting at step 1, 2, 3 or 4, all these other platforms that start at platform 9, 10, 11, 12 are intimidating beyond measure. And whether you are, a small post-production facility, a wedding photographer, or you are a multi-site deployment, trying to hire a system admin to learn these things is tough. And that's basically where this all started. And that's where we are now, just taking incredibly difficult to understand subjects sometimes and making them chewable.
Yeah, definitely. It's always nice to be able to look at a subject and not always have the person explaining the subject assume that you know 50% about it already. So being able to kind of actually come into it and be able to learn, from the ground up, really, I think, that's really awesome.
I mean, a lot of that, I'll just interject. Even my early understanding of Unraid, a lot of that comes from your own videos, because a not dissimilar approach that you have to Unraid. If you look online about Unraid, there is extensive guides and stuff online, but a lot of them miss out steps 1 through 7, very early doors. And even some of your earlier stuff, I remember one of the first videos of yours I ever watched was the one where you were discussing how the parity works within the storage scalability of Unraid, and it was incredibly user-friendly. And you had these lovely graphics on screen that I swear a 5-year-old could follow, which very few people could say that about Unraid tutorials online.
So, what came first for you? Was it the website or the YouTube channel?
The website came first. When I was working for the said e-retailer, at that point, I was working in their marketing team, and we were working sort of with them to talk about the products, but there were subjects I couldn't talk about and couldn't cover within that spectrum that I wanted to cover, but you couldn't cover within an e-retailer perspective. So then that's where I went into kind of blogging there on the side, and then that sort of gave way to everything else that came afterwards. And that's kind of where it all began.
We were talking a couple of weeks ago when we were arranging to do the podcast. You were off to, was it Taiwan you were off to?
Yeah, Taipei for Computex. It's the second time I've been. I was hoping to go more frequently to cover that event. And that's RE3, if you will. I mean, CES is the world's kind of access to a lot of the technology and the new stuff where they bring up.
If I can just kind of butt in, sorry, for one moment. The people that don't know what Computex is?
It's effectively it's a trade show that shows off a lot of the new hardware and technical innovations coming out from the East. And again, right. A lot of those are either brand specific or kind of the back end things, your Realtek's, your NVIDIAs, yeah, all these ones that work with so many different partners, and they're showing off their innovations, which will eventually be taken up and worked forward with afterwards.
So did you see any kind of really cool new things that really took your eye while you were there?
Professionally and personally, I got served a drink by a robot, which I'll be honest, 13-year-old me lost his mind. But a lot of it was just kind of the integration of Wi-Fi 7, real actual kind of progression on that. Then there was a lot of stuff to do with, obviously AI is king, you know, from your chat GPTs to MPU processors being integrated into more and more devices. And there was a lot more real world applications being shown off, kind of model home stuff. And it's obviously the pandemic and semiconductor shortages and a myriad of socio-political factors have slowed down this subject a lot. But Computex this year and Innovex running at the same time, we just saw a lot more of that integrated home and professional AI integration come to the forefront and actually be shown off in a relatable fashion. So that was the standout for me.
Well, switching gears a bit and kind of going back to talking about NAS, I'm sure there's some listeners out there who maybe don't even know what a NAS is. I'm sure some of my old friends still think NAS is a 1990s rapper. So can you basically explain what a NAS drive actually is?
At its most basic level, and I mean fantastically basic, it's a hard drive you access over the network or the internet. And even then, I've not made it that basic. It's ultimately a storage device that can be accessed via any device in your home or business, and also has the potential to be accessed remotely when you want it. But more often than not, the word NAS is more heavily associated with a turnkey solution. And although obviously there is open source alternatives and build your own alternatives, those are more often referred to colloquially as servers, even though it will be a DIY server, a DIY NAS. Whereas on the flip side, NAS more often than not gets associated with paid turnkey hardware software combined solutions. And of course there's a huge element of ambiguity there in the middle, but ultimately that's what a NAS is. And my cat has decided to jump in because she's a fame slog. But yeah, for me that's what a NAS is, and I think at its entry point it's a backup device. After that, everything else from surveillance to virtual machines to multimedia, they're just extras. But ultimately, it's a single storage device that's accessible via a myriad of often wireless or wired means.
And why would someone prefer to have a NAS than use something like OneDrive or Dropbox?
That's a very, very good point. A lot of that there's lots of small reasons that are... And we move the cat. There are lots of reasons that are more specific end users, like performance. But a lot of it comes down to ownership. So I know that a NAS in my studio, much like my cat, can get hands on it. And before I fire her into the sky, I know that a cloud, although it might be cloud storage device, which has its place, and I do think NAS and cloud synchronization and having both as a cloud gateway is useful to a lot of users. A NAS is 100% disconnectable from everyone. Cloud drive like OneDrive, Dropbox, Google Drive, I can be 99.9% certain that's disconnected. The same goes for deletion. I can be up to, if I've got a handy volcano nearby, 100% certain of destroying the data on there, whereas that's something that's lacking on a cloud service provider. And finally, when users do buy a cloud device, buy a cloud subscription, they're kind of playing this game where you get a Google Drive and you know that in 3 years of that subscription you are going to pay X amount of money. That data has to be somewhere in 3 years anyway, so then you have to continue to pay, but you're increasing your data all the time. So then you may have to go for a larger tier and you're more in the hole. And eventually you need to remove that data from the cloud. So when you remove it, where's it going to be? On a storage device like a NAS. So if that's what's going to happen in a 3 to 5 year forecast, just buy the NAS in the first place, because you've just spent all of this money in the interim anyway. And there are downsides, electricity costs, it can cost a penny here, a pound there. And then on top of that, replacement drives and RAID functionality is going to cost more up front. But ultimately, if it's a cost that you acknowledge you're going to have to engage with in 3 to 5 years, then a NAS becomes the better choice. And also, of course, control of your data.
That's a really, really interesting thought. I've never thought of the fact that when someone has got all their stuff on Google Drive or OneDrive, one day they are going to have to move it somewhere else or continually pay forever. And so the time they actually want to have the data themselves, they are going to have to put it somewhere or just say, well, I don't want that data anymore, I'll just delete it. But I've never actually thought about that as a reason not to use them. My reasons have always been kind of privacy and just not wanting, like you say, you know, when you delete the data, has it really been deleted? And
even legally, with a lot of businesses, you're kind of, in many regards, you're on a bound to keep hold of data for an extended period of time. So you're kind of locked in that you can't leave. You can't just walk away and leave your data. And indeed, at the Excel Centre in London, they do an event there called IP Expo. And there's a company that all they do is destroy hard drives. They do a mini EMP on a selection of drives. They then wipe it, index it, and then crush it in front of you, and then turn it into like recycled toys and stuff. And this industry exists because of so many businesses they have to be 100% certain their data is destroyed or completely disconnected. And there's all these businesses that are in this, they're stuck constantly in this subscription model, because not only have they created so much data that even just removing it from the cloud is troublesome in terms of scaling, but also the sheer volume of data means they've lost track of what is integral, what is mission critical, and what is chaff. And again, within a NAS, you have a greater degree of control over that very early doors.
And talking about differences between NAS, how about direct attached storage? Can you explain the differences between a NAS and DAS, is it called? I don't know. And a SAN. Can you explain the kind of differences in these type of storage technologies, please?
Well, when it comes to, NAS, we've sort of gone through there. Direct attached storage is kind of a one-to-one, and you can't really multi-user access it. And SAN lives somewhere in the middle. Plus, there's this phenomenal performance potential with the way the block transfers are and the way you can kind of scale the area of storage to start with to get higher performance in most regards than you would in traditional NAS protocol. But you also have the multi-user access and the multi-client connection, be they an actual physical client, a user, or just a software opening up an exchange, that is just not possible on a DAS. So that's why when you get to the enterprise level tier, that's why SAN becomes more desirable. It's slightly, not quite as highfalutin as it used to be, because NAS becomes increasingly more efficient in its exchanges, but definitely SAN in the middle between the two of them appeases a lot, and ultimately why it becomes considerably more desirable at the enterprise tier.
If I've got it right, so direct attached to storage would be something like a USB hard drive plugged into your laptop. So that's basically block storage plugged into a computer, and SAN is block storage that can be shared over a network to a computer, and it thinks it's a hard drive plugged in. Am I correct in?
Yeah, again, there's a lot of things you can do when it comes to SAN level connectivity to dupe your local system into, well, dupe's a strong word, but to let your client apps and devices treat it like a localized storage device. And then, of course, on the actual iSCSI, kind of the LUN end, the SAN end of the server you're utilizing, you can be incredibly creative about how you want the storage to be built. So if you're going to be having a large volume and large frequency database, so that's, a million squillion tiny files, you're going to want to make sure that your provisioning is built around that in a way that you can't really do with an external drive, because with external drives, the amount of customization and control, is it going to be FAT32? Well, it isn't. Well, there you go. I've got two options left. And it's kind of like that. You've got so much more flexibility on SAN than that. But unfortunately, SAN is also fantastically complex. And if you set it up wrong at the beginning, you can't it's not easy to do a do-over with that. And even with the scalability of SAN, so you can create a SAN target for storage and then go, I want that to be 1 billion squillion terabytes. I've only got 20 terabytes, but I plan to scale up later. And you can create this imaginary target for you to scale up towards. Or you can just choose to lock it in, and then there are performance benefits and detriment to either one of them. But again, it just comes down to flexibility at the enterprise level. That kind of unified storage tier really benefits from that.
Right. So for us home users and small business users, just having access to shared files through a NAS, that's kind of ideal for us. So inside our NAS, can we talk a little bit about hard drives, please, Robbie?
Absolutely.
I wondered if you could help me understand the differences between the different types of hard drives. When you go on places like Amazon, that kind of place, you'll see, it might say enterprise drive, you might see CCTV drive, performance desktop drive, or a NAS specific drive. Do we really need NAS specific drives? And what's the difference between all of these different types? And does it matter?
I think if you'd asked me that question back in maybe 2005 or 6, the answer would have been, nah. But unfortunately, the real answer is a lot more nuanced now. And like any, you know what, we'll bring things down caveman. That's my style, right? Look at your cutlery drawer. You have a variety of different knives, a variety of different spoons, a variety of, different forks. I don't know how rich you are. And from there, you know that at the beginning, there was probably one fork, and then they redeveloped and created these newer different versions of it that are more tailored to a different user case scenario. You're not going to cut a steak with a butter knife, but at the same time, you're not going to use a steak knife and to spread butter unless, your dishwasher.
I don't know, Robbie, you didn't know me when I was a student. I did all those kind of things.
Pot noodle with a fork, gotcha, or a pen. But on top of it, when it comes to hard drives, early hard drive technology, the difference between individual drives are very, very small. And as the rest of the infrastructure, the client devices they were going into, could be geared certain ways, it's the same with cars and different brakes and, acceleration and tyres and stuff like that. So, for example, a traditional PC class hard drive, it can read, it can write, can probably hit, 160 to 220 megs, depending on capacity. It's not designed to be on and constantly being hit 24/7. It's designed for a nice, easy spin up, spin down. So then we would look at, say, a NAS drive. A NAS drive has much more intermittent and irregular power up, power down. It has to go into hibernation mode a lot more readily. Also, it's going to be in larger groups of drives at the same time. So that means sometimes multiple drives are being written to in this more rugged, more high working environment, and drives are being written on, but in a very irregular fashion. So you've got like right, parity, right. So it's the behaviour is slightly different there, and a lot of the time when you're reading from the drive, you're reading one piece of data spread across all of those disks. Whereas if you use traditional standard class drives, you wouldn't see the same level of performance level. And then you go to something like surveillance, where there's going to be 95 to 98% write of footage, and very rarely you're going to access the footage. So that's another way in which the drive has to be geared towards that user case. And then we break down into the whole pro enterprise thing. And a lot of that comes down to two words: durability, that the drive is going to be in an environment where it's going to be battered constantly. And then when you get to the enterprise tier, you can double down on the endurance factor there. But then on top of that, there has to be sustained performance. So these are drives that are designed to reach heights in performance, but maintain that height without getting an oversaturated cache, without the arm or the actuator inside getting overworked. And then you get into the subject of dual arm hard drives and NVMe hard drive Seagate. What is that?
And the NAS drives, when there's a lot of them next to each other, they handle things like vibration better and that kind of thing. Is it mainly kind of firmware related differences, or is it actually the build of the hardware inside the drive that are different between these drives? Where is the difference, or is it a combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two. I would argue that 10, 12 years ago, they were more physical differences than firmware differences. But now we're seeing the firmware play a bigger part. Particularly, we're seeing more frequent firmware updates as the drives are used more. And then, particularly now, we're seeing the introduction of helium into hard drives. So now we crossed the 12 TB line, and we're now getting into 22 and 24 TB hard drives. The only way that was achieved via a multitude of different methodologies was to utilise helium in a sealed casing, and therefore the platters that I wish I had my fake little hard drive to show you. My little 4-year-old welcome to school hard drive, it does my nut in, but the platter's got to be thinner. So when the platter's got to be thinner, then after that they become helium, reduces drag factor in those casings, but at the same time you've now got a much more crafted device, which therefore then you're pushing even more into surveillance, enterprise, NAS, desktop use as the capacities got higher and the way they were built became more specialised. And at that point, the hard drives become very, very similar, but then the firmware has to be geared to making the most out of that. You could, if you abandoned firmware in general and you lined up all the hard drives next to each other, they're probably very, very similar inside, although some of the enterprise ones will have a little bit more onboard cache. And there's this whole Optinode thing with WD to eke out a few more terabytes. But ultimately, the firmware in more recent hard drive releases is where the drive is being given better control of the crafted elements inside, more tailored to the end use.
And inside NAS and enterprise drives, there's a feature, TLER, time limited error recovery. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what that is and what it does.
Well, I believe that's to do with the amount of time the drive is left after, calling an error would be a bit strong, but the recurring revisit of the drive. And I think that's another example of the drive, some drives having support of that within the NAS structure. Again, you've caught me off with that one. I'm thinking about the TLR as the drive, how frequently a re-attempt to read from the drive is made. And I think more modern hard drives have really upped that and got the drive to effectively, even as soon as it hits a wall, to already be beginning the next attempt. But a TLER, the last time I was really focusing on that was around about 2019, 2020, and a lot of that was to do with WD and the whole SMR business before. So again, perhaps things have moved forward. How
I understand it works is, you're quite right, it's how many times it will continually try and reread an error. A desktop hard drive, I believe, it will keep on trying and trying and trying. But the problem is when you have that, it can make the drive drop out of a RAID. So the TLER will stop it trying so much, so the drive won't drop out of a RAID system.
I mean, as we move,
I might be wrong, but
I was going to say, as we move more and more into SSD populated server systems, because the cost of NVMe SSDs have come down, there was a spike, Chia, semiconductor shortages and the like. As we're seeing more and more of SSD utilization, be it in caching or in a hybrid tiered storage fashion, more and more users are becoming less bothered about recurrent error attempts, because SSDs by their nature already have that. They've got that whole blueprint ideology of access the whole drive at once, whereas a drive has obviously got a more linear approach to it. So it can overcome or ignore errors or work around, or we'll get back to that error in just a few milliseconds. Be right back. But yeah, we're kind of hearing about that less and less at the moment as SSD occupation increases.
Right. And also in drives, the very large hard drives, some of them are SMR, is it called SMR hard drives? Shingled magnetic recording. What is that? And do you think we should avoid hard drives that are made that way, or are they as good as other hard drives that don't use that technology? I
mean, there's a few different outlooks. Probably one of the more common outlooks is hate it, don't want them, hate it. And the real answer is probably a little bit more balanced than that. And again, we referenced the WD thing there, and we'll come to that in just a moment. But shingled magnetic recording in a drive is, as the name as a roof would suggest, that the writing action inside is ever so slightly overlapped, and it allows a drive to actually achieve higher capacities at a lower price point. But it's built around the idea there has to be a sufficient amount of idle time for the drive to recalibrate kind of the written sectors and the index internally. And if a drive isn't given that down idle time to recalibrate, then that's when they become problematic and therefore unsuitable in a NAS. Now, circling back to WD got in a little bit of trouble because their WD hard drives, certain capacities, I think it was the 2, 3, 4 and 6 TB drives, were SMR drives but not advertised as such. And there were lots of people putting them in things like a true NAS or free NAS by then, and other server systems where if you were doing constant activity with this drive and you suffered a drive failure, or the drives reached 100% capacity and then you wanted to include a new drive and start expanding your existing RAID, you still weren't given the system enough time for downtime, and it increased the potential for for the drive RAID recovery or RAID expansion to fail. And that was why utilization of SMR drives, or drive managed and host managed SMR, I'll cover that in a bit, became incredibly unpopular. However, SMR drives are still very common these days, and as we generally you find when a new capacity tier, I think 26 TB was the latest one, the earliest capacity tiers that get rolled out are SMR. And if you have a host managed SMR drive, there are ways and means to regulate the drives a little bit more to allow and actually profit by the use of SMR drives in a larger RAID environment. I personally still don't massively recommend it unless you're running a particularly high-end system with particularly proficient host-managed SMR capabilities. But yeah, SMR drives, I personally wouldn't recommend them to most NAS users outside of very specific environments.
What do you think of the practice of people, they're not using NAS drives, they're looking for something a bit cheaper, is shucking a drive from an external hard drive? Are the hard drives inside external drives as good as if you bought, say, the same drive that wasn't inside a case? I don't know how much it is nowadays. I think the drives are pretty much almost the same price, but it used to be cheaper to buy the same drive in an external case and take the drive out. But I heard that a lot of times they were drives that failed quality tests that they'd put in external hard drives. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Robbie, about people using shuck drives.
Well, I had heard that last point you made there, and I wrote an article and made a video about this, self-plug. And I did do a video and an article on this, and I'd heard that, but because I couldn't find anywhere to back it up specifically online, I didn't include that. But I have heard not a dissimilar point to that. But mainly, you're right about the cost of shucking drives these days is generally comparable to standard buying drives internal bare. And of course, shucking a drive, you're generally throwing your warranty away. You have a drive that has a soldered connector in some cases, or a bridging device that can often be attached to the top of the drive. And also, despite my efforts to try and create a database of shuckable drives, I've almost completely given it up, because I created a massive database of evidence online from like everything from Reddit to individual forums to buying patterns to Amazon that showed the internals of some external drives and the drive that was inside. But then I found out one change of a serial number later and it's a different drive. So it became incredibly inconsistent. But on the other end of the seesaw, one, if you go for a device like an external that has more than one drive inside, so it's maybe a RAID 5 device that's got 4 WD-RAIDs in drive, the saving potential there is huge. Right. Because those ones where you generally find the prices, it isn't just a case of £10 off each drive, but somehow the pricing on there, because they accept users are going to lose a drive in the RAID capacity calculation, I'm not sure, but there is a huge savings to be made in shucking in that fashion. Then you've got some drives that when a WD, for example, do you know what, let's be fair, let's say Seagate this time. Seagate will go ahead and go, right, we've produced 10,000 units of these 10 TB drives. We're going to put 3,000 of these in externals, and the other 7,000 we're going to sell bare. Now, these bare ones are more subject to things like inflation, profit margins, and ultimately their price point from after manufacture is more floaty-toty all over the place. But the ones that go into external casing go into a completely different pricing bracket and sale and demand. And you will often find, and again, we saw this enormously during 2021 with that cryptocurrency Chia. I think it was 2021, it might have been 2022. You must have seen loads of people wanting to make Unraid Chia servers and stuff. And with that, people were buying up external hard drives to shuck those drives. The reason being because normal hard drives at 14, 16, 18, whatever the TB limit was at that point, were changing hands for silly money. And the e-retailers were aware of that. But the external, the boxes that were pre-populated, DAS boxes predominantly, but the odd WD, MyCloud and Seagate Backup Plus and stuff, the pricing on those didn't increase notably for lots of different factors. So they ended up getting, people would just buy them, sell the empty case, because that's another way to recoup your loss as well, selling the empty enclosure. And ultimately, shucking, I do still think is very much a thing, but the brands are nailing it down so much by adding those little bridge board things on the top of them, not only nullifying your warranty, but in some cases not giving people any indication of the drive that's inside, and then white labeling those drives as well, which is another big factor, I think, where you will get a drive that's the same model ID as a bare drive, but it's been white labeled, which again leads to this question of, is it a quality control issue? Did they specifically tailor this drive for an external or otherwise?
As well, sometimes when you shuck them, didn't you have to kind of bridge 2 pins on the...
I forgot what that's called. There was a particular connector on the top. I can never remember what it's called on the top of a hard drive. I don't think it's just power, but old servers would have an actual interface going into that one. And I know a lot of the time those plugs would either be completely removed and therefore barring their use in some cases, or wouldn't run at all unless they had that inside to start with. We don't see as much of that anymore due to mass production technique, I imagine. Also because a lot of that was available to IDE and ATA drives that had that interface built into the pins, but you see it less now on SATA drives.
Talking about cheaper drives as well as like Shucking drives, what do you think about refurbished drives? What's your opinion on these drives? Is it normally the manufacturer that's refurbishing these when you see them in places like Amazon, or is it like a reseller refurbishing them?
Well, I have seen refurbished drives as an option listed on quite a few official websites. I don't see it as much anymore, but I have seen it like previously. Personally, for the right setup, I would not be averse to refurbished drives. Indeed, again, I'll have to double check this, but I did a video recently, self-plug, arrogant beyond the extreme. I did a video about, is it better to have fewer larger hard drives or lots of smaller drives? And then use, RAID calculation.
That was a question I wanted to ask you, actually. That in your opinion, what is better? If I wanted, say, a 20 terabyte of usable space, would I be better off to have 2 20 terabyte drives and just have 2? Or would I be better off to have maybe, 3 10 terabyte drives?
The issue is there is no answer, because the user case scenarios, there's pros and cons on either side that will befit a different user. So if you look at, say, a 4 or an 8 bay, server device, NAS, be it turnkey or DIY, you're going to need a bigger PSU. You're going to be, you open the door to maybe having a better CPU to get more out of it and eat more, a bit of 10 GBE, because more drives equals higher performance, but it also leads to more points of failure. You can save money by going for multiple drives often over going for larger drives, which are often newer, and therefore the newer drives, we've seen examples in the past that a lot of people won't jump on the bandwagon with a new drive because the failure rates are up there sometimes, depending on the drive. So there are arguments for either side. I think it really does come down to a user case scenario. It's not always which one's going to be the best money, because in a lot of our calculations, and I believe WD, Seagate and the like, throw Toshiba in, why not? These brands, they're aware of the calculation, the whole price per terabyte, and they've brought it closer and closer and closer together to a point where the savings one way or the other are actually quite minimal, but it's the system you're putting them in. So if you buy a 20 TB drive, score, but you need 2. You can't have 1, because you've just put all your eggs in one basket. So this drive that costs you 500-600 nicker, you've just spent £1,000, 1,200 quid, and you've not even got the enclosure. So the savings, and also you don't get the performance as mentioned earlier, whereas if you've got a bunch of 4 TB drives for that same amount of money and you put it in a RAID 5, you've spread out your points of failure. You need a bigger enclosure and everything, of course, but the performance you will get while reading off of 4, 6, 8 drives, you can max out a 10 gig with that. That's fantastic stuff. You're never going to max out a 10 gig with 2 20 TB drives. If you're lucky, you're going to hit 450 megs on a good day. So there's no real one answer. There's just a huge separation of variables that can apply to different end users.
Yeah, I find personally when I'm using in my Unraid server in the main Unraid array, I prefer to go for as fewer large drives as possible, because the data's not striped across on the Unraid array. I don't get any performance benefit from having multiple drives. As well, I haven't got a lot of slots in some of my servers, so if I wanted to actually increase the size of the array later on down the road, like as the main array on Unraid, we can add drives to it, increasing it in the future. But if our parity drive isn't big enough, we can't add a larger drive. So I always like to try and keep as fewer drives as possible. But now ZFS is in Unraid 6.12. I'm in the process of building a server next week with some SSDs in. I chose to get some 2 terabyte SSDs, and I had the choice between buying 6 2 terabyte SSDs or 3 4 terabyte SSDs. And it was cheaper to buy the 6 than the 4. And I ended up having a slightly more capacity. And like you say, the speed increase, with the stripe data over the SSDs made me choose the smaller drives.
Actually, and the last point to add to that, I should have mentioned earlier, the incremental cost of failure, which I believe is a Steven Seagal film. When you're running a system that's got, say, 10 2TB drives and one of those fails, now you should have a hot spare on a shelf, of course, everyone at home, say it together, but at the same time, you can nip out and buy a 2TB drive. Now, if you were running 10 TB drives and one fails, you're down 200-300 nicker. Just like that, and you've got to go out and get that, and there's got to be availability for that. And despite modern hard drive production getting better and better and better, and this is, I have no statistical research to back this up, other than every single Black Friday, every single Cyber Monday, and working in e-retail for a long time, there's always more of the smaller capacities than the big capacities. And I don't know whether it's a resource thing, that is brands knowing that they are going to sell more of certain hard drives, or that larger hard drives are purchased en masse and they're bought in cartons of 20 at the data center level or unified storage level. But all of the smaller drives, none of the big guys are going for those. So you can go to your local e-shop and then get a bunch of 1, 2, 4, 6, 8 TB drives easily. So I think I'm going to update my article after this. Definitely a reason, that whole kind of incremental cost of failure coming this summer.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If a drive fails, it's much nicer. It costs you $100 or £100 to replace than $300 or $400. Yeah, most definitely. I'm going to ask you, before we move on to speaking about SSDs, because I want to speak to you about SSDs,
cool.
about Western Digital Device Analytics, or WDDA. Now, I know you're
Sorry,
have
the sleeves are going up now. The sleeves have got to go up.
So, can you, for people who know nothing about it whatsoever, explain what it is and why it is so controversial at the moment?
Well, credit where it's due. A chap, Will, over at SpaceRex, again, another NAS platform over in the US there, he was pretty much the one that brought this to everyone's attention. It was only after Zooming with him and doing a few emails back and forth that we started talking about looking at this from a lot of different NAS brands, because he really doesn't cover too many beyond True NAS and Synology and a few smaller like pocket bits like that. But the long story short is, and I wish I had a WD drive here to show you, I believe it was 2019-20, don't quote me on that, alleged. They rolled out their alternative to Seagate's iWolf Health Management, which is a kind of it's either on the drive or it is an on-system utility that is accessing the drive and taking a lot of the values not dissimilar to that of smart, and in some cases reinterpreting the smart data in new, more user-friendly metrics to alert the end user to the health of your drive. So when you do smart tests on any drive, they are tremendously useful. Smart tests have been around for donkey's years. They will continue to be around for a long time to tell you about, bad sectors, spin up, unload cycles, power on, how long, etc. But where WDDA fell foul a lot of public opinion, one particular value, the power on hours, because users started cropping up saying their WD drive reported power on hours equivalent to 3 years on the mark, to say your drive has now been on for 3 years. You might want to consider replacing it. Now, this power on hours warning, notwithstanding that it was included apparently on a lot of Pro Series drives, which have got a 5-year manufacturer's warranty, which is a lib, but on top of that, it was how it was being handled by the connected host systems that it was in. So the earliest reports were Synology NASs that were running DSM 7.0. It has since been removed from later revisions of DSM, I should add. Had it turned off by default, but if a user turned on WDDI, Western Digital Device Analytics, from within the storage manager, if the drive said your drive has been on for a certain number of hours now, you might want to consider replacement, the Synology would then push a notification to the end user and put the storage into a warning, which for anyone who owns a server with mission critical data, that is serious brown trousers time. That is terrifying. Because all of a sudden, your drives, which you've purchased at the same time, remember, which you've put into the system at the same time, and therefore power on hours is going to be not dissimilar, often, 1 or 2 hours between, is going to result in your drives one by one saying warning, and you are going to freak out. And a lot of users went out and bought drives, apparently. What Will was saying with one of his clients as well. And this was the whole business. Although the WDDI tool and the health monitoring tool seemingly, I don't know how much of it is unique data. A lot of it seemed to be reinterpreted smart data from what we could see, but presented in a much more user-friendly fashion. That power on hours thing has rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. And now, although Synology, again, removed it as of, I believe, midway through 2021, and it's in no later revisions of Synology's DSM platform, QNAP have just rolled out QTS 5.1, which has WDDA support included, and you can't turn it off, and it's on by default. But we have no way of modding and forcing a drive to give that 3-year warning without waiting 3 years to see how the QNAP interprets that. QNAP have spoken to me and said that their system interprets this as information, not a warning, and it won't put the storage manager into a warning state. It won't also shout at the end user, buy bloody drives. It won't do any of that. But
these companies, do they partner with WD? Is there any kind of financial incentive? Like you say, after 3 years, it's going to sell quite a lot of hard drives. If a company integrates the WDDA into their system and saying your hard drives need replacing, that's quite a lot of sales after 3 years. I
mean, I'm obviously, without knowing for certain, I'm reluctant to say whether that is the case, but my instinct says, with regards to collaboration at least, I don't think the NAS brands would have collaborated with WD to that end, because Synology ditched it very early doors, and QNAP have only just added it to QTS from something that was rolled out in 2019 to 2020. Now, QNAP integrated it, from what I could see, as part of their predicted failure migration service. So QNAP have got this thing, I'll make it very, very brief, where when you have a hot spare drive at the moment, if one of your drives falls over and knackered, whatever you want to call it, your hot spare jumps in and your RAID starts rebuilding. If it was ZFS, it would be a lot quicker. But
So basically, it's making you use your hot spare when you don't need to.
Yeah, but what this might do within a case of predicted failure with the QNAP is the drive is being monitored with as many health monitoring tools as possible. Seagate, Ironwolf, WDDA, their own drive analyzer, Smart. And when they can see indications that the drive could potentially fall over soon, then it integrates this drive. And therefore it clones the drive rather than the RAID degradation and the RAID rebuild, which can, 8, 12, 24 hours. It's cloning this drive that's showing signs of dodginess with a new drive, and then it just powers down the system and swaps the new drive in, and you've got no downtime. The problem lies with if WDDA is influencing that, then as you say, the drive failure prediction might replace that drive on the basis of the drive being on for 3 years, even though in every other regard, smart tests, and just in general, it's a healthy drive. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm willing to bet somewhere around you is a hard drive that's been knocking around for longer than 3 years in operation.
Oh, for sure.
I've got one 9 years that I walk past every day. I want to kiss it if it wasn't electric. But yeah, so WDDA, I don't think it's a financial incentive by the NAS brands integrating it. I don't think money has changed hands any more than them integrating Seagate's Ironwolf Health Management with the data recovery. I can't speak for WD because WD reinterpreting these metrics in the WDDA to make them more user-friendly sounds quite nice. But if they'd repackaged this hours on warning to your drive has been on for your drive with 3 years warranty has been on for 2 years and 11 months. It's about to go outside of warranty. We just wanted to let you know. That sounds great to me, because there are people out there that add 10 years warranty replacement spares on their washing machine. They get the extended warranty on everything, and when the warranty is almost up, they flog the thing and use the money towards something new. It's quite common. So if the warning had been interpreted like that, I'd like that, actually. I'd really like that. I wish drive manufacturers did that. They won't, because then they open themselves up to pointless RMAs. But I think that would have been a better way for that message to be delivered.
Do you think, Robbie, that say you had a NAS drive, you had four drives in it, for instance, you didn't have a hot spare, you ran it for 6 months and you thought, I really should get a hot spare. So you go and buy another WD. So you've got 4 of the drives that are 6 months older than your hot spare. It comes to the 3-year point and come up with the warning, and it swaps it for your hot spare. Your hot spare is already going to be 2.5 years old. Or, even if you've had your hot spare, say, for even longer than, for 3 years as well, it could literally do a hot spare and go, oh, actually, you bought this one only 2 days after the other one, so the hot spare will still be, even though it's not really being used on those power on times, it will still be reporting the same information, I assume. I
will smash stuff, cry, go to the pub. I would be absolutely livid. And the thing is, people online have made much more, I would say, eloquent descriptions than myself as for case scenarios. And the most compelling for me, which sort of impacts me, but not really, but it is, for me, the most astute argument. Imagine you are either a system admin or you're an installer, you're a service provider, and you 2-3 jobs, maybe 5 jobs a week where you set up people's storage for them. So that's maybe 3 to 5 jobs a week. You've been using this very specific setup that is fantastic for that business model. They're, content creators, they're post-production, they're an editing suite. So you're creating this setup for them and you're doing it, and then all of a sudden you wake up one morning. And because remember, it's power on hours as well, so people do power it down, so it won't be the domino effect per se, but then all of a sudden you've got freaked out businesses that you're on a retainer for, or that you signed off on a warranty period that you take care of warranties for them, and it's all going bananas because they've all suddenly woke up to amber lights everywhere and hot spares suddenly getting swapped out unnecessarily in specific configurations, and you have suddenly got a workload that you're not really going to be paid for, and all of this down to a warning that has no real bearing on anything. It's the equivalent of saying the metal has become slightly less ionized. It might as well be that. The depth of this warning. So yeah, that's the big brouhaha about this. And it's again, SpaceRex, slightly more so than me, is really pushing for WD to remove this on their drives, because it's one thing for all the NAS, and indeed, and I'm not sure about its position in things like TrueNAS or Unraid. I imagine it isn't integrated into that, but then I just simply don't know. That he would like it if it was removed utterly from WD drives, whereas from my point of view, I just want to make sure as many NAS vendors do not integrate WDDA, or at least disable this one warning, because the rest of the warnings, or the information being presented, they're reinterpreted smart data to my mind, and therefore they actually have an element of use, because telling a slightly more novice end user that your unload load cycles are too high, they have no idea what that means. Whereas if you say to them, this drive has been spun up, spun down, powered on just a little bit too much, frankly, they're going to understand that. It's, it's caveman speak.
Yeah, it's very naughty as well, I think, for them to have the warning when it's 3 years if they have a 5-year warranty on a hard drive. It should only be 5 years. That's really bad, because they're saying, like you said earlier, that their 5-year warranty isn't really kind of worth the paper or or the pixels it's written on.
So I should have mentioned it earlier. One of the big barriers, again, that we've encountered with this is the information is so scant online. WD has its own page that's been there for 3 to 4 years, I believe, and it's incredibly non-descriptive. Then the NAS brands themselves have put very, very little resources out, and there is no index online what WD drives have this on board. There's just nothing online detailing it, so we don't know. All we've got is conjecture, forum reports, and the drives that we've managed to test. So a lot of the information we've gathered, unfortunately, has to come under the heading of hearsay a little bit, because we're going by some random Reddit post in some cases, but there's enough evidence to kind of underline this point, I think. And it's enough that I think for a lot of users, much like the SMR business we talked about earlier with WD, that have made them go, ooh, that's not nice. We don't like your business practice. Like, we could, Seagate for a long time, let's be frank, were kind of the dumpster fire for a lot of users in terms of hard drives. It was like, oh, the Seagate drives are cheaper. Oh, well, I'll deal with it. And WD had this spotless reputation about a decade ago in terms of hard drives. I don't know what's going on in the last decade.
Yes, it sounds a bit of a shame they do that. But I think your idea of just vendors having it disabled for that particular reading and keep all the other ones on there, or even just have it off by default and people can switch it on if they want to, and it explains that it doesn't mean you need to actually change the drive. It's just a warning that it's been in use for a long time. I was thinking, like, do you know at all why, talking about smart data, why has that never been standardized? Like, every vendor, their smart data is slightly different and, is interpreted slightly differently. Any idea why? I guess there's just never been a standard for it, is there?
I would have to guess. I mean, the bits of it that aren't universal, I think, would probably come down to their own secret recipe for their hard drives they wouldn't want to give away. Because even though, there's a million squillion hard drives released every year from these brands, a lot of the production and even the firmware is probably locked up pretty tight. And I think it would be tough for them to give away a lot of their secret sauce that goes into it. I mean, if we look at the newer generation of hard drives that are rocking out with, like WD rocking out OptiNAND to free up some of the space on the platters to get bigger hard drives, then you've got EAMR, HIMR, and we're talking about like companies in the tens of billions of dollars. They're always trying to cut ahead. I think, is it the end of this year they want to have 30 TB drives live, and by the end of the decade 50 and 100 TB drives? They get there by being secretive as all hell. And I think standardization of smart data, they would probably fight against it a little bit for that reason. There will be some values, again, power on, load unload cycles, blocks, that are going to be standardized for the most part. And I think when the smart test is performed can differ depending on systems, whether it's a physical action, a scheduled action, or every time the drive is booted. I think there is disparity there as well.
Like, I know with smart data, sometimes a lower number is better and sometimes a higher number. And they have this kind of tolerance. The tolerances can be kind of different between different vendors. A low number with one can be better and a high number with another. Like, it starts at 100 and if it goes below 40 as your threshold, that's really bad. But then you can see the threshold is 40 and you see that your hard drive is like at 100. And you think, oh, does that mean that's really bad because it's over 40? But the bad thing would be if it's under 40 and that kind of thing. I've always found that smart information very difficult to understand.
But again, that's probably not. Again, this is not me defending WD at all. But WDDA, when it was first envisioned, and again, we've got to add disclaimer and, allegedly, all the information we found online with WDDA was that it was initially rolled out for WD Purple drives for surveillance. Right. Now, in that arena, a lot of these surveillance devices, they have a surveillance feed, a bunch of camera feeds, your pan, tilt, zoom and all that lark. But the actual management of storage bordered on caveman, bordered on terrible, because it just went, where's your storage? It's over there. Okay. And that was it. You couldn't do anything. So what WDDA in that context was for was to allow the drive's own health monitoring and management to be translatable to your Hikvisions, your Anchors, your Reolinks, your DVR vendors, and then those systems could then have that interpreted data and then splashed it into their own GUI, which is why when WDDA first rolled out, this is getting really boring, I'm sorry, but WDDA when it was first rolled out was available as an APK for all of these vendors to integrate into their own GUI. So in that context, when your system doesn't have a robust hard drive or storage media health monitoring tool and sophisticated warning system, WDDA makes a lot of sense. But the minute you roll it into a NAS system of any version of NAS, again, we can go turnkey, open source, or anywhere in the middle, those systems have robust storage management. They have the skill set and the options, the customization and the control to handle that. And WDDA is not necessary in that arena.
I think the WDDA, it's quite a nice idea in a way, because being able to interpret smart data in a human readable form is quite a nice idea, but hopefully they may just kind of change that bit and improve the WDDA going forward. And it was just a bit of a mistake. Anyway, kind of moving on, I'd love to talk to you about SSDs, if I may.
Fire away.
So in the context of kind of NAS systems, what do you see the pros and cons of using SSDs are, please, Robbie? And also, really, what specific use cases would you think for a NAS to have SSDs as opposed to not?
Well, up until about 2 months ago, my perspective was pretty solid on SSD utilisation in NAS. Again, we're adding that caveat. You'll see why in a bit. So SSDs in NAS, you have to have a NAS system that has a sufficient CPU that can afford the number of PCI lanes to make the most of it. Now, if you go for SATA SSDs, which again are becoming increasingly affordable, in that scenario, you don't have to worry too much about the CPU because the amount of SATA lanes that are all paired up for all the individual bays that you're laying out. It's the same for hard drives and SSDs. But SATA SSDs, again, they will advertise 5 to 550 megs, but realistically, you're looking at somewhere about 450 peak, except if you're using very specialised and targeted setups. Whereas hard drives are now available that go up to 285 megabytes per second, and we're starting to see reveals of hard drives getting to 300 megs. And then you've got dual actuator drives, a hard drive with 2 arms, that can hit 440, 450 megs. And these are hard drives that can have 16, 18, 20 terabytes. So the need for SATA SSDs has rescinded. Whereas NVMe SSDs in a NAS is starting to boom. So NVMe SSDs in NAS, be it because the NAS has the slots there, or we're getting better CPUs and the price of NVMEs coming down, has all resulted in this vogue towards NASs either being fully or partially populated with NVMEs. And up until about 2 months ago, I would have said it was largely a waste of money for anyone underneath enterprise. Because if you don't have a CPU that can spread out its available lanes, if you're going for like a Celeron that's got 8 lanes to play with, each one of those NVMe SSDs that can hit 4,000 megs can't exceed 1,000 megs each. So you're capping immediately, and one of the amazing benefits of M2 NVMEs gets lost in translation because each one can only give you 1,000 megs, and the CPU has to go hell for leather, needs at least 8 gig of memory minimum to really make the most of it. So you end up kind of losing out on some of the benefits of the SSDs. However, 2 months ago, Asustor NAS brand, nowhere near the clout of your big names out there, they released something called the Flash Store, and it broke a lot of the preconceptions. It's a 6-bay NVMe Intel Celeron powered system, and it's $499. It's got 4 gig of memory in there. It's as quiet as a mouse that's asleep. And even though each of the lanes are limited to 3 times 1, for $499 for a 6-bay M2 NVMe system, Celeron, custom built, tiny, well ventilated, I struggled to try to build that. I tried to spec up, and they include software with it. BTRFS, full UI, mobile apps, desktop, the works. There's even remote access available as well with their own domain. So I was trying to figure out how could you even build something like that at this price point. And then they released the 12 NVMe version, which has got 10 gig on board as well. So that's about $850 for 12 NVMEs. Now, again, they're all restricted, but all of my reservations and issues with restricted bandwidth or limited bandwidth availability, because remember, that is that's an 8-lane CPU with 12 NVMEs inside, and they're using a little bridge, they're using a PCI bridge internally to make it work. But at that price point, it costs less than most 8-bay hard drive turnkey solutions in the market. And at $499 for the 6 one, I'm not a salesman, but I just couldn't figure out how they could piece it together financially. And now, from what I understand, all of the NAS brands are working on M2 NVMe solutions. So in the last few months, I've seen this change towards people's attitudes to M2 NVMEs in NAS because of the decreasing cost of M2 NVMEs and the decreasing cost of the NAS, the flash systems that use it, have removed that big bottleneck factor from people's budget and their minds because they've realised, well, I'm not spending 2, 3, 4, 5 grand on a compact flash server, or 10 to 20 grand on a rack mount U.2 server, I'm spending 500 nicker on this server that's M2 NVMe all the way through, which opens the door to multi-virtual machine utilization, container utilization, Plex Media Server. I did 8K Plex Media Server transcoding on a £499 NAS, which is insane, for 8K playback, real 8K HEVC. And then when you've got users that are running, again, high volume, high frequency databases where the utility and benefits of M2 NVMe multi-user access really come into fruition, this tiny little compact server that's about this big is just insane. And we're seeing more of these solutions throughout this year.
Even though the bandwidth isn't there to run all the NVMEs at full speed, in reality, you would never have all of the drives running at full speed anyway. So for a lot of people, you wouldn't really notice the lack of bandwidth running all of the NVMEs. And like you say, it is an amazing price point for £499. Was it £499 or dollars?
It's $499, so dollars as well. But again, that's 6 M2 NVMEs that are restricted to 3 times 1, but they're in a RAID. So there is performance benefit internally to them all being afforded together.
I think a lot of times companies, like you say, you don't know how Asus could do it so cheap. I think sometimes business models for companies when they're not established in the market is they come in with a product and they make a loss on it. Yeah, and then all the other brands are like, how can you do that for this amount? And it gives them a reputation and they're happy to lose the money in order to angle them into the market. They're probably making a loss on each one of those in order to basically give them a reputation that they don't have in the NAS market, maybe. I
think, and at the moment we're seeing, funny you should say that, this, again, I didn't know if we would talk about this. I love talking about it anyway. This growing middle ground between turnkey NAS solutions, QNAP, Synology, TerraMaster, Asustor, all of that lark. And at the other end, you've got your pure DIY, so build it from the ground up. You use Unraid, you use TrueNAS, you use, Open Media Vault, a myriad of different open source options out there. And we're starting to see more and more this middle ground of companies that are just producing pre-made NAS servers with no OS. They might lump on Unraid, in a trial version or TrueNAS, but they're releasing these hardware solutions in the middle. And a lot of the time, and a case in point, the Storaxa, they're being designed arguably as loss leaders themselves, so this company can build a reputation and then maybe release their own OS down the line. So this middle ground that's expanding by people, again, Topton is another one with their little mini servers we're seeing rolling out. We did a review of one of those that had a Pentium processor inside, an N600, and that system is so remarkably cheap. It's like 250, 300 nicker for this quad-core Pentium system with M2 slots ready to go. And on the one hand, you have the open source crew going, wait, why am I even... I think even Linus Tech Tips made a video on this very subject when he was talking about that Asustor device, going, why am I wasting time building when it's costing this little to have these things now? And then you have the turnkey solution providers.
And so on the Asus one, could you run anything on that?
Absolutely. I mean, again...
So I could buy one and run Unraid on one of those Asus boxes.
And can I recommend, if you do that, to Google it first, because you'll find my video. He said arrogantly. But yeah, 100%. They do not endorse it. They don't like it. But I've installed Proxmox, TrueNAS, and Unraid on Asustor systems and QNAP as well. A lot of these NAS brands, they either run from an internal DOM, little 5 gig flash module inside, but stick a keyboard, stick a KVM, keyboard video mouse, go into BIOS, change the order, USB, stick in your USB, done. And if you want to turn it back to the original OS, BIOS, reset it, remove your USB key, and then that's it. And in most cases, unless you do something particularly horrific, I don't think they would have to prove you've invalidated your warranty there, which most NAS brands probably wouldn't do. So that's one of the reasons I've seen a lot of users who they're money rich, time poor, which I know is an incredibly trite description, but rather than build their own NAS and get a Mobo from Scan, go to eBuyer and get the hard drives and the SATA cable, and go to about 3 different vendors, all of which have their own RMAs, to build it, sit on the floor, and have that horrible moment to press the power button with your fingers crossed and praying to the gods of IT. All of that time is, you can now just buy a custom-made solution from a lot of these either middle ground providers or the turnkey NAS providers, and they just lump on your own OS. It's really interesting the way things have developed, and with a lot of open source software, and again, Unraid, probably the most user-friendly of all of the software-only NAS softwares on the market. You can just simply download, try for free. All of those have become increasingly more user-friendly and easy to install on this hardware. And I just don't think the NAS brands like it that much, but that's what people are doing.
And I think, for Unraid as well, the fact, if you buy one of these turnkey systems and put another OS on, the fact that Unraid runs off a flash drive and that flash drive runs into RAM, you're not wasting one of the disks inside your NAS with the actual OS for the NAS, so you're able to use your hardware a little bit more. I saw your video on putting Unraid on QNAP, and I tell you, I really like the part of your video, and I think everyone should go and watch this part, and I'm going to put it as a link in the show notes where you describe how to format a USB stick that's larger than 32 gigs in FAT32, because Unraid needs FAT32 to boot, and it's really great to see your way of actually being able to format.
Did I use DiskPart and then Rufus? It was a while ago. I can't remember what I did. In my head, it was using DiskPart to format, and then I used Rufus to create the ISO.
You use Rufus just to format in FAT32, because Windows will go, no, that's more than 32 gigs. You're not allowed to do that. I'm sorry.
I like it somewhere like Windows. They're like, what year is it? It's 2023. No, we're not formatting FAT30. Are you serious?
We have exFAT now, Tell them to use that.
Make it double exFAT. Unbelievable.
And with QNAP, can most of the ones install Unraid on? Obviously, the ARM-based ones can't.
Well, the ones that have got an integrated graphics CPU and therefore have HDMI out.
And why do they need that, Robbie?
Because you can't UI into it. You need the means to make the QNAP allow you to get into BIOS, because otherwise you need a visual output to get into BIOS to switch away from the DOM, because otherwise by default it will always load from there.
Anyway, I'm going to switch gears a little bit,
right.
And I would like to ask you about ransomware.
Well, keep it light, right?
Can you explain what ransomware is, and how it differs from other kind of cyber threats like just a regular virus? And what are the motives behind ransomware attacks?
I think a lot of people that are watching this podcast, a lot of us are, the old school. So when we think of viruses and we think of a PC covered in pop-up windows and, nightmares, the nightmare scenario. And what makes ransomware different is ransomware tries its damnedest to not harm the system it's in. It's one of the few invasive threat actors that doesn't try to destroy the system. All it wants to do is get inside, zip up everything into a completely inaccessible format, leave a little ransom note, generally on a digital rolled up scroll on a knife stabbed in the wall before it leaves, that effectively says, if you want access to your data, you've got to pay us via this specific means. More often than not these days it is via Bitcoin and a Bitcoin wallet, because it is incredibly difficult now and impossible to trace for them to be found out via those means. But then worse still via this methodology is, unlike normal malware and major viruses which target big files generally, they'll kind of see someone being able to get in and then attack the larger file structure. Ransomware starts at the bottom more often than not, and it goes for the smallest files. The reason being, it can do more files and it heightens the percentage chance of hitting that payload, that wonderful pay file that someone goes, they're the photos of my child from when they were 0 years old. They're the ones I'm prepared to pay for because they're irreplaceable.
If I could just butt in very slightly. So just for people, I'm sure everyone listening to the podcast or watching it knows, but what ransomware does is actually encrypt the files and hold them to ransom. Yes.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I just
no. You're right. But when it comes to when people's perception of ransomware, whenever we look at big corporations that get hit by ransomware. And most people go, yep, well, they're a big corporation. They should have paid for a lot of system admin and security and about 8,000 VPNs. And when smaller groups are impacted by ransomware, there is this vibe of, well, the brand shouldn't have let me down. But unfortunately, the truth of ransomware is that I'm not going to say the majority because I don't have the statistics to hand, but a significant body of people that are impacted by ransomware, it's often because they punched holes in their firewall or ignored a lot of the warnings that are presented to them by the system when they're setting it up. And then later on, then you come into this road of having regular updates. And there is this quasi-relationship with ransomware is who is truly culpable. Obviously, the threat actors performing it they're dog dirt. But it is where the end client device can only do so much. When we talk about open source, for example, I know I'm going on a slight tangent, but I will reel it in, I promise. When we're looking at, say, open source, a lot of the open source platforms, like TrueNAS is a fantastic example. If you try to set it up in an insecure fashion, TrueNAS just goes, no. If you really, really must do this very silly thing in this very silly way, then click this box that goes, I take all the risks. Not a lot of NAS brands do that, and it really winds me up they don't do that. The reason that a lot of turnkey NAS solutions have been hit recently by ransomware, and again, we'll talk about Deadbolt, I assume, but several brands were impacted by that, was because, on the one hand, users were handling their device unsafely, but a lot of these devices were advertised as simple, easy to use, chewable, crayon user-friendly, knobbers like me on YouTube saying as such, and then the NAS device comes out and it allows these users to set it up in this insecure fashion. So yeah, ransomware attacks are getting more frequent, and it's worse than a virus because at least with a virus, no one charges the virus. The threat actor with a virus doesn't leave you with an invoice, if you know what I mean.
And what would you say is a good set of things for someone to do to help prevent them having a ransomware attack in the first place? Are there certain protocols, best practices?
Well, definitely these days, port forwarding and just punching holes in your router and your firewall and stuff is so much less necessary than it's ever been. And I think a lot of users are slightly unaware of the fact that when they need remote access, that when they do remote access their server, they either use the one that's provided by the NAS brand and the third-party brands as well. And I think Unraid as well. I forgot what the Unraid one is called that allows remote access. You sign up to something. I can't remember what it was. I'm sure you're going to correct me in a moment. But things like Tailscale now exist. And lots of other VPN-type splinter that actually give a decent amount of performance. And installing them allow you to completely nullify unencrypted transmission between you and your device remotely. And a lot of them can be tailored towards third-party apps. Now, on the subject of third-party apps, most third-party apps now, everything you need is kind of there. And a lot of people that are installing third-party apps on their NAS systems, a lot of the time, grant these apps way too much access. So when you install an app for the first time, some NAS brands will say, what directories do you want access to? What privileges do you want this to have? Much like your mobile phone when you open an app for the first time. And then it goes, hold up, do you want to give it access to the camera? Or hold up, do you want to give it access to your contacts? Not a lot of apps on NAS platforms. I include all the NAS platforms actually, open source or turnkey, provide that. But it is there. So you can install pretty much anything, first or third party now, go straight into the control settings and remove all of the access. And the same thing goes with some NAS devices now, have an isolation mode. You click it and any third-party app, anything that uses remote access PHP type stuff, any of that can be disabled in a heartbeat. And after that, really everything else is just small increments of protection. So disabling your admin account, randomized ports, These are things that now we're starting to see NAS brands actually say during setup, we won't allow you to use the admin account. You have to disable it. Or when you set up the device for the first time, it won't allow you to run certain apps or services without tick boxing all of those protections.
Basically, it's keeping the server secure from, obviously, the internet. So that would also, I guess, include things like your router and firewall, keeping the firmware on that up to date as well. So it's not just your NAS or your server you need to keep secure. You need to keep the gateway of the internet coming into your house secure. You don't want to be using old firmware on a 10-year-old router.
That was another big area that Deadbolt impacted people, because a lot of I think it was 3,500 users, I'm sure someone will correct me, that were hit by Deadbolt, and a lot of those devices were running super old firmware because people took the device home, set it up in the corner, and never updated the firmware. But I mean, I don't know how much console gaming you do, but if you own a PlayStation 4 or 5, if you don't update the firmware for a couple of revisions, you can't access the internet. It just won't let you. It won't allow you to use online services. Now, there are users that would hate to have that on a NAS server, but I personally think that would be great. If you're not updating to the latest firmware, you can't access remote level services. Same goes for two-step authentication. It should be set up that, no, you can't do this much unless you enable two-step. But these are very strong positions to take.
Yeah, I can totally see your point, that because you're only as secure as your most recent patch or firmware update.
One step.
But I'm the opinion that people should be able to kind of choose. I look at it as like, say I want to go and buy a Ferrari, and Ferrari put a limiter on so I can't go above 70 miles an hour. I shouldn't go above 70 miles an hour, but it should be the kind of user's choice. But like what you were saying earlier, I think all of these things should be in every kind of situation. If you're not doing the right thing, you should be highly warned, and you should have to literally tick a box to say, I know if I do this, this could go horribly wrong, but I know what I'm doing, and hopefully it shouldn't do.
It's like when you set up a PC for the first time, to use a reference from earlier. I think anyone that's ever built a PC DIY or does it more regularly, how often have you had a motherboard on a table connected to a PSU on a table, connected to a hard drive on a table, and the case is still in the shop. The case is still in the shop, Ed. And therefore, in that scenario, anyone else you saw doing that, you would lose your mind. But because you're doing it, it's okay. And I think it's on the back of Deadbolt when QNAP did effectively a pushed update on lots of users as a reaction to Deadbolt, because their handling of the situation was not great. But they did a push update and updated lots of people's servers to the latest server revision to stop further users being impacted by Deadbolt that weren't the first time. But the problem is, if you were running lots of VMs in your business, if your server isn't one of these 5-minute turnaround reboot, it's actually a quite complex reboot scenario where you had iSCSIs suddenly lost, you had dynamic IPs that you probably shouldn't have had on DHCP that all of a sudden have changed their identity, and you had VMs and more. That hacked off even more people the way that was handled. But again, it comes down to that whole, should you update or not, and should you be forced? Should you be allowed to do it your own way?
Why do you think people don't like to update? I love doing an update. As soon as there's an update, I get quite excited, and I like to click and do an update. But why do you think there's a lot of people who don't like to bother to update things?
Well, I think part of updates, it's that whole business of security updates and feature updates. And I say that as a man who, in the bottom right of my screen right now, is still being offered Windows 11. And I'll tell you right now, it's still going to be quite a long while before I upgrade to Windows 11. Now, why is that? Because I'm used to Windows 10. I didn't want to give up Windows XP, if I'm honest. I still think about it. I've got a picture under my pillow. But it's the idea that there'll be change. I feel like there'll be things that don't work. There'll be adaptations and changes, or maybe even a little bit of modded script that I think will not work in this newer version. And in terms of NAS, we've already seen from all of the major NAS players, I can only speak on behalf of Turnkey. I've not followed Unraid or TrueNAS anywhere near as close. But there has been certain features that are only available in old revisions. So Synology with AI photo recognition, just certain apps and services that they reach a certain point and then they get downgraded or removed from the package center. So you can no longer get them anymore. And some of these sometimes are the reasons people bought these systems, or at least major part. So at least in the case of NAS, that's their reasoning, because they don't like change. They're worried about, certain features no longer being available or not functioning right. And from my own point of view, although I staunchly tell people to update, it makes me a big old hypocrite when I know that Windows 11 pop-up is getting ignored massively. Or I'm using my web browser and Chrome has suddenly turned around and said, there's an update. And I'm like, but I've got 18 tabs on the go. I don't want to refresh these and empty my cache.
I think all of us, we're guilty of, we say, do this. Like I always tell you must do a backup. It's really important. Always do a backup. And then maybe kind of 3 months ago, I lost all of my app data and I didn't have a backup because, I had a backup, but it was months old, because I was thinking, okay, this is only temporary. It's like this. I'll do it later. And I was a big hypocrite and I paid the price. So.
But I think it's that idea about, I'm not going to do the whole do as I say, not what I do, but we still need to acknowledge these are the right things to do with the updates, but sometimes life gets in the way, I think. But it's when people make a choice to actively ignore these things or to actively decide not to pursue them. Now, that isn't to say that
I think as well, Robbie, a lot of people, and I can imagine it would be more so with people who buy maybe a turnkey NAS, I was speaking to my brother the other day and he wanted to set something up for CCTV, and he was just saying, Ed, I just want to be able to set it up and forget about it. I haven't got time to worry about doing this, that and the other. And I think a lot of people are like that. They want to just put it in the cupboard and they forget about it, and it might be months and months. And I think to those people that are listening that do that, get your calendar, put a date 6 months in the future on a Saturday morning or something, say, I'm going to go to my NAS, I'm going to check if there's any updates, I'm going to do this. Just like you would when you schedule a service for your car. You wouldn't keep driving your car, you wouldn't buy a nice brand new top-of-the-range Mercedes or something, like you buy a top-of-the-range NAS or you build yourself a top-of-the-range server. Well, if you bought a top-of-the-range car and you just drove it till it broke, it would kind of be your fault. You think, well, I couldn't be bothered to change the oil. I couldn't be bothered to check the tyre pressure.
I feel like I'm dogpiling on users a little bit. I think it's important to recognise that, one, when people do update, it's only recently that we've seen nuance in the way updates are delivered. So it used to be that it was all updates, some updates, no updates. Now you can go for security updates or feature updates. You can actually be more selective. And also, in the case of Deadbolt, for example, it was recognised online. And I never really got it 100% confirmed that the vulnerability with at least 2 platforms that were impacted by it were vulnerabilities within specific applications, which were found because they're obviously built on Linux, and Linux can only ever stay one step ahead of all the vulnerabilities anyway. But in those scenarios, yes, if people had updated, they would have patched that vulnerability as soon as it was recognised. But then there is a window of the vulnerability that was in the back end of certain apps and the attack vector having that opportunity. And in the case of some brands during the Deadbolt ransomware impact, which impacted several brands, in some cases, that time was weeks, if not months, between the vulnerability and it being closed. And in that area, that person could have had all the updates on, but it didn't matter. So in some case, I don't want to dogpile on users too much, because there is an element of brand's responsibility and users' responsibility with regards to ransomware. And in that case, the brand did let people down. And I think now it's going to be quite a few years before people give QNAP let them wash their hands of everything that happened. I think it will be a good 6, 7, 8 years minimum.
Can you give just a brief overview of what the Deadbolt ransomware is? I'm assuming Deadbolt is like the name of the group that did the attack.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's all it did, and a lot of people, when it impacted them, their first instinct was to pull the cable out the back of the NAS from their router or switch. But all it was an injected line of code to via SSH, I believe. I have to double check that, depending on the application and its range of services it was allowed to have access to. It just injected and said, basically create a zip of all of these files. So every single file that might be a 3 meg photo turned into a 3 meg zip that was a Z-zip, 7-zip perhaps. And then from there, the actual encryption key was created and then purged from the system. And then create a Word document, a text, a .txt or a rich text format, and then just create this ransomware. And that was it. And it was all in one injected command. It wasn't installing a malware that sticks 8,000 Yahoo toolbars on your web browser and you smash your laptop into the sea. It was one line of injected code, effectively.
And that will still keep running even without the internet plugged in, because it will just chug along and encrypt all of your files.
And the worst thing was that when it happened, what they did to get people's attention, the last part of the ransomware script replaced the usual login screen for your NAS. So it was replaced by the Deadbolt screen that went, your system's been hit, you can't get in. If you want to get in, go to this key, go to this URL, make us a payment. I think it was like 1.01 or 1.005 Bitcoin. It's like 500 nicker to $1,000 or something. That doesn't.
Didn't they in the ransomware? They gave the end user the opportunity to pay to unlock their files, but also they tried to get money from QNAP themselves, saying, if you give us 5 Bitcoin, which must be 100,000.
It was 15, I think. I might be wrong. Yeah,
I think it was 5 for we'll tell you about the vulnerability, and it was 50, and we'll give you the decryption keys for everyone. So QNAP could have paid that would have been about $1 million, and they could have had the decryption keys and then decrypted everyone's files for them. But obviously QNAP didn't want to do that, and I kind of really agree with that. A lot of people may not agree with me, because I think when a company starts doing that, it's going to encourage attacks. When one company's paid, then it's going to encourage more of that type of attack, attacking the end users to hold the company to ransom, which it seems like they were trying to do as well.
Also, there is the question mark of, would they have handed over the key?
Exactly.
It's a simple, yeah. I mean, there is no guarantee of that anyway, of them handing over the key afterwards. But a lot of users during the Deadbolt ransomware attacks, their instinct, obviously, quick, turn off the machine. And the problem was, for some user cases, it completely removed their ability to interface with the NAS, because during the transition, during the encrypting of those files to produce the GUI to log in, the new login screen, it wouldn't generate. So lots of users couldn't log into their system. So the first thing you saw during the Deadbolt attacks for the first month and a bit, depending on the brand that was impacted, the brand actually had to roll out and show people how to get in to the GUI of their NAS, because lots of people would just turn the system off, or when it would turn back on, in some cases, the encryption would just then continue, because it wasn't an active installed like API or anything. It was just a command that had been delivered to the system. So yeah, I mean, the impact of it is still being felt now, because there's lots of users obviously that still hold QNAP in disdain for that, and again, they're going to have to spend still quite a few more years to wash that off their hands.
I heard, Robbie, as well, with the QNAP situation, that their malware kind of scanning software would actually remove the text file, telling people how they can actually pay. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think they should have done that? Do you think that was taking away the opportunity if someone wanted to try and pay to get their photos back? They were literally, taking away that opportunity for them. And I don't mean just photos, they're encrypted files. What's your thoughts on that?
I think the problem is, without knowing QNAP's intent, whether that was an actual intentional action or a byproduct of the malware removing tool finding that file. Now, if it did just flat out delete it, I think that's terrible. If it just quarantined the file, like a lot of antivirus or malware scanners would do, to give you the option to go, we found this file, what do you want to do? That would be different. But because I don't know, I'd be reluctant to comment on that. What I would say, though, is if it did just delete that file and at least take away people's option to do it, that's pretty disgusting.
I believe there's actually some type of file where if you have deleted your instructions of where to pay, that's actually provided by the ransomware people, you can put one of your files, you can have it scan one of your files, and it will retell you where you have to pay the ransomware to.
Oh, I didn't know that, no. I know there was one to identify which ransomware you've been hit by, which to me is one of the most depressing things I've ever heard, that if you've been hit, the first you need to know is which one it is. So you upload the file to the website that goes, sorry, you've been hit by Skull Thunder. It's terrible. But, there you are. I mean, what a rubbish bit of news. When Deadbolt hit Asustor NASs, and again, that was 2021, I believe, there was a guy that worked in an office near me, who was a photographer. He was running a lot of marketing agency stuff, and he lost 6 years of his portfolio to this. Now, on the one hand, I would love to say to him, well, where's your backup, mate? And again, no one wants to hear that. But at the same time, he'd set this device up. He'd updated the firmware pretty frequently. It wasn't even that old a firmware he'd been hit by. He'd been pretty Johnny on the spot about it, but he'd still lost all of that data. Who's to blame in that scenario? Is it Asustor for not rigorously tightening their software for vulnerabilities that they're not aware with, which are built on, Linux, which, reports vulnerabilities pretty frequently that everyone else then has to build on top of? Or is it his fault for not having a sufficient backup in place? We're all there's poo on everyone's shoes. It's terrible.
We all know everyone should have a backup, and I say, like, it's the old saying, RAID is not a backup. But if you've got a file and if you delete that file, you can never get it back. You haven't got a backup. So, on an Unraid server, for instance, if I've got 20 terabytes of files and I delete all of them, if I can't get them back from anywhere else, I don't have a backup. In my opinion, a great protection against ransomware is snapshots. If you're running ZFS, if you've got a snapshot, you can click a button and you can just be back to where you were straight away. And now we've got ZFS officially in Unraid, I would say, to anyone, for your really important data, make a ZFS pool, put your really important data there, and make sure it's snapshotted. So if you ever did have a ransomware attack, you can at least roll it back to before the time that the ransomware attack happened, and you would be fully protected. But again, snapshots aren't a backup either, but it does allow you to, roll back to how it was, before the attack happened. It's very powerful. Anyway, I think, that's enough talk about ransomware and
cool.
and depressing things. I think let's
lighten up a bit.
Let's talk about nuclear war.
I'm glad this isn't my channel. If I was going, and let's talk about a little bit of nuclear fallout. You, Karen, what's your jacket made of? Asbestos. Great.
So we've got some user questions. Well, we've got some audience questions for you. And the first question is for you, Robbie, is what is the best NAS right now for Plex, in your opinion? So the best media server NAS.
Well, price is going to be a big deciding factor. So if I break it down into pricing, that NAS I mentioned earlier, that flash door for $499, that's a good. At the moment, I'm sort of plugging that for a good middle ground. Notwithstanding, it's got a media mode on it. It supports Plex, and I've got it transcoding 8K. It means that even if you don't own 8K media now, or if you own 8K media but your TV and all your other devices don't support 8K, it can play and transcode everything down to 4K and 1080p and stuff. I mean, if your budget is 200 to 300 NECA, the Synology DS223 is not too shabby. We're running Plex on that in a container. But again, that's very low-end entry level. The problem with saying the best is every user case is different. There could be someone
it depends
that's running
how much media they got and how many people. If it's just them accessing it in their house, like them and their wife watching together, that's going to be very different than if you've got 20 grandchildren, 3 aunts, and 100 terabytes worth of media. You're going to need something very different.
And then when you factor in file formats like HEVC not being supported on certain devices, then you've got your audio files, the ones that simply have to listen to Led Zeppelin in that original file format that's a FLAC rip. That's absolutely insane. Like, for those users, you're going to have to go minimum Pentium, maybe an i3, because you need that integrated graphics. You can roll in a graphics card, but it's for Plex, it's not as efficient in that regard, the amount of power output you're putting in and the noise. I mean, for those users, basically the entry point, I would say, a Synology would be a DS920. Then if you want to go a bit better, you go for something like a QNAP 7.4 series. Again, they go from Pentium all the way up to an i9 12th gen. All of these are systems where you're trading off the power of the device versus the cost of the device versus the noise and the TDP and general power consumption of the device. A lot of those users that have large media collections, those users are going to be very aware of a server that's on 24/7, making a lot of noise and hitting the old electricity bill, particularly now, midway through 2023 and energy crises. So yeah, a 920 entry point from Synology, and the 7.4 series, I would say, for anyone that wants to take it seriously. Or if you've got a couple of M2 NVMEs from an old laptop knocking around that you want to reuse, look up that flash store, because that flash store, again, you can get the 6-bay model, stick one M2 NVMe and start racking them up. And you can get M2 NVMEs, even with QLC NAND now, they're up to 8 TB in scale. And then you add to that, for me, that kind of is the middle ground, and it's potentially going to be my recommended Plex NAS server of the year when we do our best ofs in December.
Looping back to when we were talking about SSDs, how do you find the actual durability of running an SSD server compared to a mechanical drive server? Are they more reliable or less reliable? Could you imagine you would see, say, a SATA SSD that's 9 years old sitting in your NAS box behind you in the same way from a mechanical hard drive?
I can see it now because production in NAND. I mean, again, I'll move slightly away from NVMe, but I will circle back to that in a second. But when it comes to SATA, I mean, again, we're seeing a lot more SATA SSDs arrive where the NAND production is being built to NVMe level utilization, but being used in a SATA SSD. So you've got a SATA SSD that, guns blazing, on its day can hit 500 megs if you're lucky, but they're using NAND that's being developed at production for SSDs that can crank out 7 to 8,000 megs. So consequently, the NAND is built to a standard, or at least to a production quality standard, to withstand so much more than it did before. NAND is considerably more durable than it has been for a long time, and we're seeing a lot more SSDs arrive with a drive writes per day, DWPD, of exceeding 1.0, which means you could get a terabyte SSD, completely fill it, delete and rewrite 1 terabyte on this 1 terabyte drive every day, and it would still last 5 years according to the manufacturer. So yes, it's substantially more durable than they've ever been.
Moving on to the next question for you, Robbie, is will you stop recommending Western digital discs after the WDDA and the 26 to 80 hours warning?
So that's what we discussed earlier on.
It is, yeah.
I still continue to recommend WD drives, but nowhere near as much as I did. When I talk about WD red drives now, I talk about them with a caveat. And the minute you're talking about something with a caveat, you're doing it because you want people to be fully aware of everything. But there's no denying that I'm going to add the caveat for a long time that, oh, are you going for a WD red drive? Oh, yeah, actually, they're a good drive as long as you don't go for the SMR ones. Or if you're going to go for a WD drive in your NAS, great, just make sure WDDA is disabled by default. Or if you can't disable it, just know that at 3 years, it may spit a warning at you that you can largely disregard. And I hate adding caveats like that, but it's sort of their own fault.
And the next question, which is kind of in a similar vein to the previous question, is they're saying, why do you continue to recommend QNAP NAS after Deadbolt? With
QNAP and Deadbolt, I think I recommend quite a lot of QNAPs to be kept offline. I also think that the brand has introduced a lot of network security precautions and changes to default structure within their OS. I still maintain in every QNAP review towards the conclusion, I highlight Deadbolt. If you look at any of my before you buys, generally you'll find that the 3rd or 5th point is always they were hit by Deadbolt. And I think I'm going to be doing this probably till the end of the decade, because they need to have an unbroken record. Now, time was when I talked about Synology a long time ago, I would highlight Synolocker, because I can't remember if it was 2012 or 2014, back in the very early days of me really getting into NAS, they were hit by a malware. They were hit by Synolocker that was locking up the system to try to make money out of people. Now, Synology, they dealt with it, I would argue, slightly better than QNAP dealt with Deadbolt, but they were still hit by it. But now you look online and there's not much information about it. And that's because they learnt their lesson. They carried on, moved forward, really rigorously changed their security protocol. And although some of the decisions they've made, such as streamlining USB compatibility, changing a lot of the applications you can use on their system, all they say in the aid of security and keeping their system as robust and as protected as possible, we can't deny that in a decade since Synolocker, it might be give or take that, there hasn't been anything big like that happen again. There's been the odd thing pop up on their security advisory, but that's really it. So for them, that's why I don't bring it up anymore. And I will continue to recommend QNAP, but much like WD, with caveats. And I'll tell people to use a QNAP with vigorous security protocol. I will applaud them for them changing a lot of their QTS platform, disabling SSH by default, disabling the admin account, not allowing users to make insecure choices without fully acknowledging the risks. And they included a lot more third-party VPN support on their system. And again, I mentioned it earlier on with integrating Tailscale. They've done a lot of work to integrate those things in. They even rolled out their own bounty program, like Synology did. But they've still got blood on their hands, as far as I'm concerned, and they will always be presented with that caveat. But if you're looking at a NAS system that you want to get a turnkey solution to put Unraid on, or Thunderbolt NAS, or any number of hardware solutions which are just simply not available to be purchased off shelf, QNAP's a great option for those. But as long as people stay informed about it, as long as they know the past and they're aware of the risks with regards to their own choices and sometimes in the way these devices are set up, that's why I still continue to recommend them, but with caveats.
And the next question on our list is, at what point should I start considering a NAS instead of Unraid or vice versa?
Right. Well, I think we've covered most of this, but I would say because NASs are much more user-friendly, and Unraid is by far the most user-friendly. I reckon there's a lot of users that can use Unraid and never have to touch command line unless they really want to these days. I think there's been a lot of really great stuff done with Unraid there, but it still isn't quite as user-friendly as turnkey NAS solutions, and that's done by design because they want to target, again, that money-rich, time-poor user. The levels of support afforded by NAS brands is probably better. So if you need direct support from the brand, you generally get it's easier to talk to someone who's a member of that brand more quickly, I think, on that larger scale level. The range of client applications as well. So the range of applications for your iPhone, your Android, your desktop there is just enormous. The number of client applications that once you go into open source platforms, and again, I know Unraid isn't strictly open source, but it still lives within that bubble, I believe. The number of client applications to keep things easy for you to interact with it, there's not as many diverse options out there. So it's the level of hardware for what you're buying, the amount you put in to buying creating your own DIY server can be intimidating. And if you don't know what you're doing building it, you don't want to get, a bit of silicon under your fingernails. You don't want to, have to deal with a bunch of warranties. And NAS is a good choice. And that's why I think for those that want an easy first step into private server ownership, going back to the first question you asked about going cloud to NAS, and NAS is a great choice. However, once you know more about NAS and you become a lot more versed, you don't have to get to enthusiast level. You just have to use one for a while to suddenly find limitations in a NAS, which are there by design. They are there to stop you breaking the device, stop you putting it in a state where support would be required. And for those users that suddenly start feeling the glass ceiling of a NAS, that's when things like Unraid are unparalleled. When it comes to Unraid, it gives you probably the best middle ground there in terms of adaptability and customization, but also in terms of low cost and access as well. And I think for users that have owned a NAS for a while as a hobbyist, or owned a NAS and then suddenly started feeling the glass ceiling and the limitations, and you feel like you're getting treated a bit like a baby, for those users, that's when the transition to an Unraid server makes a lot of sense, because those are users that have now become skilled enough that they're feeling the limitations of some NAS systems. If you're an enterprise user, it's slightly different, because that's when you need something that's certified for your needs, and maybe your HR, not your HR, but I think in your accounts team needs you to sign off on this product, and you need it to be, integral in that scenario where you don't want to spend a lot of time, reconnecting SATA cables and stuff, where DIY is not an option. Until I ever see an Unraid turnkey solution, those users I would probably direct towards a NAS, a turnkey NAS, unless they've got a good intelligent system admin on site.
And moving on to the next question now, I just want to point out these aren't my own questions; they're all from the website. So
cool. Oh, I love this. This is going to be brilliant. What hatchet job is this? Man alive.
So the next question is, do Synology and QNAP pay you to make videos for them?
No. To date, and I think I've talked about this before, I was going to do an Ask Me Anything video on this. I've been paid by 3 brands ever. And I'll get to them in a bit. But Synology and QNAP have never paid me. They send hardware upon my request. In most cases, I never get to keep it. So I'll sign a kind of an agreement where I keep hold of the hardware for a loan period, depending if it's a particularly sophisticated piece of equipment. For example, the TS855X, I'm doing a review on that. I've got that for maybe 9 days. It's been taken away from me on Friday. I've done a bunch of videos on it. I've done some reviews. They never impact my reviews. They never tell me, oh, don't say that. And indeed, even when I did those videos where I was installing TrueNAS, Unraid and Proxmox and more on QNAP systems and, mucking around and putting unofficial memory in Synology systems, not once have they gone, we're not sending you anything again. Get out, get out. They never did that. They've never paid me. What I get from them is access to the hardware and independence. Now, if a device I believe I'm going to be using for a long time, you can probably normally see them on the left-hand side of the screen when I'm making a video. Those are ones I've got on long-term loan, or I get to keep them. So some devices, the brand will say, we're sending it to you and you can keep it. But I've never been paid by them. Generally, that's called an MDF, a Marketing Development Fund, by the brands. I know, because I have been offered by different brands money in the past, and that's paid for from their marketing budget to promote their product. But once you do that, you get told what to do. And I know some platforms do that and do engage in that, and it can be very profitable. But we generally go with ads and we go with affiliated marketing. Hence why at the end of every video I talk about links in the description that only use them if you've actually liked the video. And I find that to be the good middle ground. On the 3 occasions we have taken payment, we took one payment from Buffalo. They had just released their Windows storage server devices, and they wanted us to do a few reviews for it, and we flat out said no because we didn't have time, and they were adamant they wanted us to make some videos on it, and we were like, we simply don't have time. The only way we'll do that is if you make it financially viable for us. And it was very much in the early days, but we want independence. So we did a 3-part series on WSS Buffalo NAS, and they never got to tell us what we could say. And I think the 3rd video we were quite scathing. The second payment was with TerraMaster to have their name at the top of our site along the top bar. And we said we can't put you up there because no one really wants to click on your button. And we're running a website here. And they were like, well, can we pay a retainer to have our little menu there at the top? And we're like, yeah, sure, knock yourself out. So that was the second one. And the third one was one from the end of last year. I contacted WD and said, oh, your WD Red drives, they're going to be 10 years old. I'd love to make a video on it. And they said, that'd be great. We'll pay for it. And I was like, well, no, I was going to make it anyway. And they were like, no, we'll pay for it. We'll facilitate it to be in this way. And I foolishly said, yep, sure. And you can watch the video in the article. It's covered in the word sponsored. And they wanted it done a certain way. And I wasn't overly pleased with the result, if I'm honest. I like the video. It's quite snappy. but I would have gone into a lot more depth about the whole thing. And those are the 3 times I've ever taken payments from brands. And I thought every time we did it to upgrade the mail server, to upgrade the website to cover more traffic because it was starting to fall over a lot. And that's really it. So no, I've not been paid really by any brand. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
And second to last question, why are NAS drives so expensive?
One word, software. The NAS software is what makes them expensive. If you broke it down to the hardware, if you tried to build the majority of NASs, barring a few exceptions, take, for example, that Plex NAS I mentioned earlier, the QNAP 7.4 series. If you were to build that NAS, which costs $2,000 to $2,500 grand to buy, you could probably put it together for about 12, maybe 13 and a half nicker, but that's if you're going for a specific server case that's a 6 or 8 bay, not just repurposing an old PC tower and getting like caddies. The reason you're paying for that software is for that access for all of the utilities, for the long-term firmware updates for that software, and that's why they're expensive comparative, because unlike building your own NAS or going again for one of those Topton type solutions or that Storax or Kickstarter that's still in progress, all of those you're only paying for the hardware and a bit of labour lathered on top. Whereas a NAS, there's a lot more software to it, so it has to be a combined hardware-software solution. None of the brands realistically sell their software on its own, although you can buy virtual VM versions of that software that run on their platform. But all of them have to be a hardware-software combined solution. And that goes all the way down to like 1 bay ARM 512 meg. That's right, meg RAM solutions for about 100 nicker. Even that £100 or so, not including tax, the 20 nicker on top, some of that is for the software. So it's always the software that's making those price tags higher.
I'm not sure if we should interpret the question as well, Robbie, from the person who asked it. I'm not sure if he's also maybe asking about the actual NAS hard drives, why they're more expensive than regular ones.
Oh, that's hard. Oh, well, if it's NAS hard drive.
You know, NAS drives, I don't know if he meant NAS drives as in a NAS all-in-one, or he's meaning a NAS drive as in a hard drive. So maybe we should answer it
both
in both ways.
Well, when it comes to NAS hard drives, I would argue, again, it comes down to NAS hard drives, and they're not that much expensive, to be fair. Per terabyte, if you compare them, if we're talking about the physical NAS media, the price between a 10 TB Seagate Barracuda and a 10 TB Iron Wolf NAS hard drive, the price difference per terabyte isn't actually that much, but that is a drive that's been designed to spin up, spin down in a more sporadic environment, and therefore its durability has to be scaled to that accordingly as well. You always find, I know mean time between failure is a bit of I nearly said a negative word there, not a great way to measure drive life outside of multi-drive environments, but it's certainly higher on NAS storage media. And then NAS storage media being in RAID environments, again, adds to higher vibration sensors being required there, largely more heat being generated there, and generally more cache as well on a lot of those drives to deal with a lot of the overhead and the instructions that are handed to and from the drive controllers. I think that's mainly why NAS storage media costs more, because it's geared towards another utilization. And again, not to use that incredibly trite and very basic comparison, but if we look at cutlery in a drawer, I think a butter knife costs less than a proper steak knife, because it's about it being durable to the task. But again, that's an incredibly basic simile.
And also maybe, Robbie, as well, NAS drives often have longer warranties, so that has to be factored into the price.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a damn fine point. Yeah, 2 to 3 years to 5 years, yeah.
Right, our last question. I probably shouldn't really ask it because we've kind of answered it anyway, but I don't want to miss anyone out. So, is now the time to move over to SSD and NAS servers, and are they durable enough? How about just a yes or no answer for that one, Robbie?
I can't just say yes or no. I'm broken. I'm broken as a human being. You've exposed me. No, mostly yes. It's still going to cost you more, and if you're not using a system that can leverage at least some of the performance, then no. So if you go for some basic ARM 1 or 2 bay NAS, you're never going to be able to fully utilize those SSDs, even with or without PCI lane restrictions. So if you're running an x86 AMD or Intel based, then yeah. Or you definitely are running better than 1 gig network out. Because even though you'll never really get to fully realise the SSD speed, and you're going to oversaturate even 2.5 gig connections, even 10 gig, depending on your RAID structure, you can at least make the most of it. And internal with databases and moving a lot of the hard work away from the CPU and memory. This is the longest yes or no answer you've ever received. But yeah, I'm incapable, absolutely incapable. But yeah, yes, for most users, depending on the hardware architecture of the NAS in question.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering those questions, Robbie.
No
That's
worries.
the last of them. So I think it's a good place to wrap up. We've been speaking for quite a long time. I've really enjoyed talking to you today, and I'm sure our listeners are going to find it really interesting hearing your expertise. For people that haven't seen your website and haven't seen your YouTube channel, where can people get hold of you and see your work?
They can go to the south coast of England, and they'll generally bump into me screaming off the end of the pier that RAID is not a backup. Or they can Google NASCompares, because no one types URLs these days. Or they can find me online just under the name NASCompares or NAS Weirdo. That'll do it, yeah.
And also, guys, you can obviously see all the links in the show notes below.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me on.
Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and speak to you soon.
Cheers.